The Zarkonian Empire had ruled the eastern spiral arm of the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their ships were faster, and their weapons more deadly than any species they had ever met. And when their scout fleet picked up the simple radio signals, coming from a small blue planet in an ordinary star system, the High Commander named Vexthor did not think twice about what to do next, because the planet would be taken, and its resources would be claimed, and the people living there would become slaves or they would die. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the TSS Horizon, which was humanity's first real deep space exploration ship. And the mission had been simple enough until now because they were supposed to map nearby star systems and look for signs of alien life, and when the unknown vessels appeared on their sensors and dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond the moon, Jake felt his heart start racing with both excitement and fear at the same time. He turned to his communications officer, who was a young lieutenant named Amy Price, and said to her that she needed to contact Earth Command right away and tell them that they had company out here, and Amy's fingers moved quickly across her control panel as she sent the urgent message back home. The response from Earth came back fast, and the orders were clear enough, which were to watch the alien ships and try to talk to them, but do not fight unless they shoot first. And Jake watched the alien fleet, which had 7 massive warships, and each one was twice the size of the horizon, and they moved into a formation around Earth's orbital space that looked very organized and very threatening. Down on Earth, the president, whose name was Helen Carter, called an emergency meeting with military leaders and scientists, and everyone looked worried as they gathered in the Situation Room, and General Paul Hayes, who was the chairman of the joint. Chief studied the displays that showed where the alien ships were positioned, and he did not like what he saw at all. Paul said grimly that the aliens were setting themselves up for orbital bombardment, and this was a classic siege formation, and they were definitely not here to have a friendly chat with humanity. And a scientist named Dr. Lisa Freeman, who ran the newly created Xenological Studies Division, pushed her glasses up nervously and said that they should try to talk first because this could all be some kind of misunderstanding. The Zarkonians sent their message, and it came through in hundreds of different languages because they had already sampled all of Earth's communication networks, and the translation was very clear and very cold because it said that humanity had to surrender within 1 full day or face total extinction, and all humans would be absorbed into the Empire and fighting back would be useless. President Helen Carter read the message 3 times before she looked up at all the people around her and said that the aliens were giving them just 24 hours to surrender the entire human species, and General Paul said carefully that they needed to think about their options for responding to this threat. Helen's voice was steady when she said that there was only one response to a threat like this, and that response was to fight back no matter what the odds were. Up in orbit, Commander Vexthor watched the primitive planet below with complete satisfaction, because his tactical officer had reported that the humans only had very basic space technology and no energy shields at all, and their weapons were just simple kinetic projectiles that would not even scratch the hull plating of Zarkonian warships, and this conquest would be over very quickly. What Vexthor did not understand and could not know was that humanity had spent its entire existence getting better at one particular skill more than any other, and that skill was warfare itself, because while the Zarkonians had conquered other species through having better technology and bigger numbers, the humans had clawed their way to the top of their planet's food chain through being adaptable and stubborn, and having an almost crazy refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. Jake Morrison got new orders from Earth Command, and the orders were very brief, because they just said to buy humanity some time, and he looked around at his crew of 40 brave people who had all volunteered for humanity's first trip to the stars, and he made his decision about what to do next. He told Amy to open a communication channel to the alien fleet on all frequencies, and Amy said that the channel was open and ready, and Jake took a deep breath before he spoke. He said that this was Captain Jake Morrison of Earth calling the Zarkonian vessels, and that they had received the ultimatum, but humanity needed more time to coordinate a response from the whole planet, because Earth's government structure was complicated, and 24 hours was just not enough time, and he requested an extension of 72 hours instead. Vexthor's response came immediately, and it was not in words because a bright particle beam shot out from his flagship and completely vaporized one of Earth's communications satellites, and the message was very clear without any words being needed at all. On Earth, the clock was now ticking down, and humanity began getting ready for the first war between planets in the history of the species, and what the Zarkonians did not know and could not guess was that they had just made the worst mistake that any species could possibly make. They had given humanity a common enemy, and nothing unites humans faster than having someone from outside who threatens all of them at the same time. In military bases around the world, alarms were sounding and soldiers were suiting up, and scientists were pulling out experimental weapons that had never been tested and might not even work properly. And factory workers were being told to start making missiles around the clock and up in space stations. Astronauts were checking weapon systems that had been installed just in case something like this ever happened. The people of Earth looked up at the night sky and saw the alien ships hanging there like dark stars, and everyone knew that tomorrow might be the last day of human civilization, but instead of panicking or giving up, they got angry because humans do not like being threatened, and they especially do not like being told to surrender. Jake kept the horizon close enough to watch the Zarkonian fleet but far enough away that they could maybe escape if things went bad, and Amy was recording everything the aliens did and sending it back to Earth so the military could study their formations and their movements and try to find some kind of weakness. The aliens thought they were dealing with primitives who would either surrender or die quickly. But they were about to learn something that every predator on Earth had learned over millions of years, which was that humans might not be the biggest, or the strongest, or the fastest, but they were the smartest and the most determined, and they never ever gave up. General Paul Hayes stood in the newly created War Room, which was a converted missile command center buried 300 feet below the Colorado Mountains, and all around him holographic displays showed the positions of 7 Zarkonian warships, holding orbit around Earth along with the scattered positions of humanity's quickly assembled defensive fleet, and he knew that what they had was not nearly enough, but it would have to be enough anyway. Paul commanded a status report, and Colonel Steve Martinez, who was from Air Force Space Command, stepped forward and said that they had moved every armed satellite into better positions, and the International Space Station had been emptied of people, and they had loaded it with all the nuclear warheads they could fit inside, and basically they had turned it into a giant floating bomb. Paul said that the Zarkonians would just destroy the station the moment it started moving toward them, and Steve agreed, but said it would work as a distraction at least, and he pulled up another display that showed something else, and he explained that they had launched 63 civilian spacecraft including commercial ships and private vessels, and billionaires with space yachts and space tourism companies and mining operations, and basically everyone who owned anything that could fly was volunteering to help, and most of the ships had no weapons at all, but the crews were mounting whatever they could find. Dr. Lisa Freeman came over carrying a tablet computer and said that she had spent hours analyzing the alien communication signals, and what she found was that the Zarkonians had a very strict chain of command, where everything went through their main command ship, and if humanity could somehow take out that ship, then the others would lose their coordination and might not know what to do. Paul said that was a very big if, because their weapons might not even be able to get through the alien shields. And Lisa said then they needed to get creative, and she pointed out that humans had always been good at that. All across the planet, similar scenes were happening in every country because in Russia, a colonel named Dmitry Volkov was coordinating the launch of every remaining intercontinental ballistic missile they had, and the nuclear payloads were being changed and reconfigured for space combat, and in China an admiral named Zhang Wei was organizing a network of mass drivers and turning big industrial magnetic accelerators into makeshift railguns that pointed up at the sky, and in Israel scientists were working frantically to turn a prototype directed energy system that was meant for missile defense into something that could shoot at spaceships. Captain Jake Morrison and his crew on the TSS Horizon had become humanity's eyes in space because they were maintaining a position near the Zarkonian fleet and feeding tactical data back to Earth constantly, and Lieutenant Amy Price, who was watching. Her instruments reported that the aliens were getting impatient because there was increased communication traffic between their ships, and she thought they were preparing to start firing soon. Jake studied the tactical display in front of him, and he could see that the Zarkonians had positioned themselves in a textbook orbital bombardment formation where each ship covered a different part of Earth, and when they started firing, billions of people would die in the first few minutes. He asked how long until Earth's counterattack was ready, and Amy replied quietly that it would be 18 minutes, and Jake knew what that meant, which was that they needed to buy Earth 18 more minutes somehow. He activated the ship-wide intercom and said that this was the captain speaking, and everyone knew this might be a one-way trip when they left Earth. But now they had a chance to make it mean something important, and he told engineering that he needed everything the reactor could possibly give them, and he told the helm to plot a course that would intercept the Zarkonian command ship because they were going to get the aliens' attention. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Carlos Ruiz started pushing the fusion reactor past every single safety limit that existed, and he muttered to his team that the captain had guts, and they needed to make sure he had the power to back those guts up. The horizon accelerated toward Vexthor's flagship, and alarms immediately started sounding on the Zarkonian bridge because their sensors picked up the movement, and the tactical officer reported that a single ship was approaching, and it was the same primitive vessel that had contacted them earlier. Vexthor watched with amusement and told his weapons officer to arm the forward batteries and destroy the approaching ship. But Jake had one advantage over the aliens, which was that he was willing to be unpredictable, and as the Zarkonians locked their weapons onto the horizon, Jake ordered a wild corkscrew maneuver that sent the ship spiraling past their firing solution, and the alien weapons missed. Jake brought his ship within 5 kilometers of the massive alien vessel, which was close enough that their point defense systems could not track something as small and agile as the horizon, and he shouted now, and the crew did what they had spent the last hours preparing for. The Horizon's crew had taken every spare bit of material on the ship and converted it into kinetic projectiles, and they vented everything all at once, including tools and furniture and metal plating and even personal belongings, and this created a huge cloud of debris that peppered the Zarkonian hull, and it did not do any real damage, but it accomplished something much more valuable because it made Vexthor absolutely furious. The High Commander roared at all his ships to destroy that insect immediately, and 3 Zarkonian warships broke formation and started pursuing the horizon as Jake led them on a dangerous chase through Earth's orbital space, and the distraction worked perfectly because the remaining 4 ships were now out of position, and their firing solutions were disrupted. On Earth, General Paul Hayes watched his tactical display update with new information, and he said that Jake had just given them the opening they needed, and he ordered all units to execute Attack Plan Alpha and told them to launch everything they had. The sky lit up with fire as humanity's counterattack began, and from the surface, hundreds of missiles streaked upward, leaving trails of fire across the night sky, and humanity had nothing that could match Zarkonian technology in a fair fight, so they decided not to fight fair at all. Every nation launched everything they had, including intercontinental ballistic missiles and anti-satellite missiles, and space-capable drones and experimental weapons that had never been tested beyond the drawing board, and the first wave hit the Zarkonian shields, which absorbed the impacts easily, and energy barriers flared bright blue as nuclear warheads detonated against them and created miniature suns in orbit. But humanity's strategy was not about having overwhelming force, because they did not have that, and instead it was about overwhelming numbers and persistence and never giving up, and wave after wave of missiles kept hammering the Zarkonian shields. And while each individual missile did almost nothing, the constant bombardment forced their defensive systems to keep cycling continuously, which drained power that could have been used for attacking Earth. Colonel Steve Martinez coordinated the civilian fleet and told all civilian craft to execute scatter pattern Delta and make themselves hard targets, and 63 ships of completely different designs started moving, including cargo haulers and luxury yachts and mining vessels and even one retrofitted space hotel, and they all carried improvised weapons like mining lasers and industrial cutting torches and magnetic grapples loaded with explosives, and one billionaire even brought a collection of antique firearms that had been modified to work in vacuum. Commander Vexthor realized very quickly that he had made a terrible error, because in his anger he had allowed one primitive ship to disrupt his entire formation, and as 3 of his cruisers chased the small human vessel through orbital debris, the remaining 4 ships found themselves surrounded by what seemed like an endless swarm of incoming threats. From Earth's surface, hundreds of missiles continued to streak upward, and they left trails of fire across the night sky that people on the ground could see even in daylight, and humanity had nothing that could match Zarkonian technology in any kind of fair fight, so they simply refused to fight fair. And every nation had launched everything they had, including weapons that were old and weapons that were new, and weapons that had never been tested outside of a laboratory. The Zarkonian shields absorbed the first wave with ease, and the energy barriers flared bright blue as nuclear warheads detonated against them, and each explosion created a miniature sun in orbit that lit up the darkness of space, But humanity's strategy was never about overwhelming force because they did not have overwhelming force, and instead it was about overwhelming numbers and persistence and simply never stopping. Wave after wave of missiles hammered against the Zarkonian shields, and while each individual missile was basically ineffective, the constant bombardment forced their defensive systems to cycle continuously, and this drained power that could have been used for their weapons or their engines. General Paul Hayes kept giving orders from the war room, and he shouted to keep firing and not give the aliens a single moment to breathe or regroup, and his voice was hoarse from yelling commands, but he did not stop. Colonel Steve Martinez was coordinating the civilian fleet, and he told all civilian craft to execute scatter pattern Delta, which meant they should spread out and make themselves difficult targets, and 63 ships of wildly different designs moved into attack positions, and they carried improvised weapons that ranged from mining lasers to industrial cutting torches to magnetic grapples loaded with whatever explosives the crews could find. A billionaire named Greg Coleman was piloting his luxury spacecraft toward the nearest Zarkonian cruiser, and he said over the communication channel that his ship had cost him $40 million, and he was about to make it worth $40 million and one. He accelerated his ship to ramming speed, and the entire vessel was loaded with every explosive his crew could find, and the Zarkonians finally noticed him at the last second, and they fired a point defense laser that clipped his wing and Greg's. Ship started spinning wildly, but momentum carried it forward anyway, and it slammed into the cruiser's shield at over 3,000 meters per second. The shield held against the impact, but the explosion created a visible ripple across the energy barrier, and more importantly, it proved something that humanity needed to know, which was that the shields had limits, and they could be stressed. Steve immediately ordered all civilian craft to focus their fire on the same shield sections, and he told them to concentrate their attacks instead of spreading them out. And in space, dozens of ships began targeting the same points on the Zarkonian shields. Over and over again, Captain Jake Morrison was still leading 3 Zarkonian cruisers on a deadly chase through space, and his ship's hull was covered with scars from near misses, and the reactor was running at 130% capacity, which was way beyond what it was designed for. Lieutenant Amy Price called out that they had a problem, because the aliens were starting to predict their maneuvers now, and they were learning how humans flew their ships, and that meant the Zarkonians were adapting to human tactics. Jake said. Then they needed to do something the aliens could not possibly predict, and he studied his tactical display and saw the cloud of Earth's atmosphere below them and the distant glimmer of the moon above, and he asked Carlos in engineering if they could skim the atmosphere. From the engine room, Chief Carlos Ruiz's voice came back strained, and he said they could maybe skim it, but whether they would survive, it was a different question entirely. And Jake told him to do it anyway, and he ordered the helm to take them down at maximum velocity. The Horizon dove toward Earth and picked up speed as gravity grabbed hold of the ship, and the 3 Zarkonian cruisers followed right behind them because their more powerful engines could easily keep pace with the smaller human vessel. But as the Horizon hit the upper atmosphere, something unexpected happened that Jake had been counting on because the ship's hull began to glow from friction heating. But the Horizon's smaller profile and the heat shielding that humans had designed for atmospheric re-entry let it cut through the thin air, while the massive Zarkonian ships, which were designed only for space combat, began to struggle badly. Their shields started flaring as atmospheric friction created superheated plasma around their hulls, and one cruiser pulled up because the commander was not willing to risk the dive into atmosphere, but the other 2 continued their pursuit even, though they had slowed down considerably, and their shields were being stressed by both the atmospheric entry and the continued missile strikes from Earth below. Jake said that now was their chance, and he told Amy to send a message to Earth Command with their exact coordinates, and tell them to concentrate all available fire on the 2 ships that were following the Horizon. Just seconds later, a coordinated strike from ground-based railguns and missile batteries all converged on the 2 cruisers at the same time, and the experimental Israeli energy weapon, which had originally been designed to shoot down ballistic missiles, fired its first shot in actual combat, and a beam of concentrated particles lanced upward through the atmosphere and struck one cruiser's shield at the exact same moment that 3 nuclear missiles impacted the same section. The shield collapsed completely, and for the first time human weapons struck Zarkonian hull plating directly, and conventional explosives did very little against the advanced armor, but they proved something vital, which was that the enemy could be hurt, and they could bleed. Commander Vexthor watched his tactical display with growing disbelief, because these primitives should have been completely crushed in the first exchange of fire. But instead they continued to fight with a ferocity that seemed to border on complete insanity, and they threw themselves at his ships with no regard for the odds or for their own safety. He watched as they coordinated attacks from the surface and from orbit, and from every single vessel they could launch, and a mining vessel deliberately rammed itself into one of his ship's point defense arrays and sacrificed itself just to create an opening, and through that opening a dozen armed satellites fired their payloads and managed to damage the cruiser's sensor array. In the war room, Dr. Lisa Freeman was analyzing all the battle data that was streaming in from every source, and she said that the aliens were adapting, but they were doing it slowly because their doctrine was very rigid and they expected enemies to fight in conventional ways. Paul said then they needed to keep being unconventional, and he told Steve to launch Phase 2 of the battle plan. Phase 2 was humanity's most desperate gambit yet, because if the Zarkonians thought the first waves of attacks were chaotic, they were completely unprepared for what came next, and humanity took every single piece of space debris, and every decommissioned satellite, and every piece of orbital junk that had been left in space over decades of space exploration, and weaponized all of it. Using remote guidance systems and small thruster packages that were hastily attached, thousands of objects began moving toward the Zarkonian fleet, and individually each piece of debris was completely harmless, but together they created a deadly obstacle course that forced the alien ships to constantly maneuver, and this burned their fuel and drained their energy and kept their shields raised at all times and prevented them from focusing on offense. Thousands of objects ranging from defunct satellites to spent rocket stages to broken pieces of old space stations began swarming toward the Zarkonian fleet, and the aliens had to deal with each one, and their weapon systems were firing constantly, and their shields were taking impacts from debris moving at orbital velocities. The battle for Earth had turned into a brutal war of attrition, and humanity was proving that when it came to stubborn refusal to die, no species in the entire galaxy could possibly match them. The battle had raged for 6 hours straight, and space around Earth had become a graveyard filled with debris from destroyed missiles and shattered satellites and scarred spacecraft that created glittering clouds reflecting the light of continuing explosions, and the Zarkonian fleet had been reduced from 7 ships down to 5, with one cruiser completely destroyed by a suicidal ramming attack, and another crippled so badly it could not fight anymore. But humanity had paid a terrible price for this, because thousands of missiles had been expended, and dozens of brave pilots had sacrificed themselves in suicide runs, and entire defense grids had been burned out from overuse. And in the war room, General Paul Hayes studied the tactical displays with grim determination on his face. Colonel Steve Martinez said quietly that they could not keep up this pace much longer, because they were running out of ammunition, and Paul asked how long they could maintain current engagement levels. And Steve replied that maybe they had 2 more hours before they were down to small arms and harsh language. Dr. Lisa Freeman looked up from her analysis station and said that they did not need 2 hours, because she told them to look at the alien formation, and she pointed out that they were falling back into a defensive cluster, and that meant they were afraid. Paul studied the display carefully and realized she was right, because the Zarkonian ships had abandoned their aggressive bombardment positions and pulled into a tight formation with their shields overlapping and all weapons pointed outward, and it was clearly a defensive posture. Lisa continued and said that the aliens had come here expecting an easy conquest, but instead they had lost ships and taken damage from a species they had considered primitive, and their commander was reassessing the situation and probably calling for reinforcements. On the bridge of his flagship, Commander Vexithor was indeed reassessing everything, because his tactical officer had just provided the latest damage report, and it showed 2 ships destroyed and 1 disabled, and the remaining 4 all carrying various degrees of damage, and the human resistance had been far more effective than any intelligence had suggested was possible. The communications officer reported that the humans were trying to contact them again, and Vexthor growled at him to ignore them, and he ordered his fleet to prepare to withdraw to lunar orbit, because they needed time to repair their ships and bring in reinforcements from the Empire. But before the fleet could move to lunar orbit, a new signal appeared on their sensors, and Captain Jake Morrison and the battered TSS Horizon emerged from behind the moon, and they were not alone this time. Vexthor's tactical officer asked with, confusion what he was seeing because the sensor readings did not make any sense, and there were 6 massive cargo containers coming around the moon being pushed by mining tugs. Jake had spent the last hour frantically coordinating with the lunar mining operations because humanity had established 3 small bases on the moon for extracting helium-3, and while they were civilian operations, they had very powerful industrial equipment. Jake transmitted to the Zarkonian fleet and said that this was Captain Morrison calling, and he asked if they wanted to see what humans were really capable of, and he said he would show them humanity's industrial capacity. Behind the horizon, the 6 massive cargo containers emerged from lunar orbit being pushed by mining tugs, and the containers had been filled with lunar regolith, which was just moon rocks and dust, but there were millions of tons of it, and it had been accelerated by powerful, industrial thrusters that were normally used to launch ore shipments back to Earth. Vexthor said dismissively that those were just rocks and nothing to worry about, but his tactical officer said with alarm in his voice that the velocity readings showed they were traveling at 0.03 light speed and impact would occur in 40 seconds. At that velocity, even simple rocks became devastating weapons, because the laws of physics did not care about technology, and kinetic energy was kinetic energy, and Vexthor ordered evasive maneuvers immediately, but the cargo containers suddenly burst open and created expanding clouds of projectiles, and there were simply too many rocks spread over too wide an area. His fleet's weapons destroyed many of the incoming rocks, but there were millions of them ranging from boulders to pebbles, and the impacts against the shields created brilliant flashes of light, and one Zarkonian cruiser, which had already been weakened from hours of continuous battle, saw its shield collapse completely under the barrage. Hundreds of rocks, some no bigger than pebbles, struck the hull at relativistic speeds and punched through the armor plating like it was paper, and the cruiser began venting atmosphere and spinning out of control. From Earth, a new wave of attacks, coordinated perfectly with Jake's bombardment and every remaining weapon system, fired simultaneously in one final desperate push, and Lieutenant Amy Price coordinated the timing from the horizon, and she told all Earth forces to launch on her mark, and she counted down from 3 to 2 to 1 and said, "Mark." The combined assault was absolutely devastating, and nuclear missiles and particle beams and railgun projectiles and improvised kinetic weapons all converged on the Zarkonian formation, while their shields were stressed from the rock bombardment, and one cruiser took a direct hit to its reactor housing and exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the lunar surface like a second sun. Vexthor finally lost his composure and commanded all ships to make an emergency jump to hyperspace, and he ordered them to retreat immediately because this battle was lost. But humanity had one final surprise waiting, because Dr. Lisa Freeman had spent the entire battle analyzing Zarkonian technology, and she had noticed something very interesting about their faster-than-light drives, and they created a specific energy signature just before jumping, and that signature could be disrupted with the right kind of electromagnetic pulse. Lisa transmitted to the surface and said now, and told Greg to fire. And on the surface, the Orbital Defense Network fired one last experimental weapon, which was an electromagnetic pulse device that had been designed to disable satellites. And it had never been tested at this scale, but humanity was well past the point of playing it safe. The pulse hit the Zarkonian fleet just as they initiated their jump sequence, and 3 ships managed to escape, and they flickered out of normal space and disappeared. But Vexthor's flagship, which was already heavily damaged and had its systems strained, suffered a complete cascade failure. The jump drive shut down completely and stranded the massive warship in Earth orbit with its shields down and its weapons offline, and it was now just a floating piece of metal. In the war room, silence fell across everyone present as the tactical displays updated with new information, and Colonel Steve Martinez checked and rechecked his displays because he could not believe what he was seeing. Paul Hayes let out a breath he did not know he had been holding, and he asked if they had just won, and Steve said that he thought they actually had because of the 7 ships that had arrived. 3 had been destroyed, and 1 was captured, and 3 had run away. Captain Jake Morrison's exhausted voice came over the communication channel from the horizon, and he said that Earth Command, this was Morrison, and he was reading the same thing on his displays, and he asked what the orders were. President Helen. Carter had been watching the entire battle from a secure bunker deep underground, and she stood up and straightened her jacket and made her decision about what to do next. She said to secure the vessel and take the survivors as prisoners, and someone needed to get her a science team immediately, because if these aliens thought they could conquer humanity, then she wanted to show them what humans did with new technology. And she paused before adding that someone needed to get all those brave people who had fought today on the line, because she wanted to personally thank every single pilot and every soldier and every civilian who had just saved the human species. As the adrenaline of battle began to fade, humanity took stock of what had just happened, and they had fought the most advanced military force they had ever encountered, and not only survived, but actually won. 3 weeks after the Battle of Earth, as humanity had started calling it the captured Zarkonian flagship, hung in lunar orbit, and it was swarming with human scientists and engineers who were studying every part of the alien technology, and Commander Vexthor sat in a cell that had been designed by Dr. Lisa Freeman, who had insisted they treat the prisoners according to Earth's laws about war, even though the Zarkonians would never have shown the same courtesy to humans. Admiral Jake Morrison, who had been promoted after the battle, stood outside. Vexthor's cell and the alien commander looked smaller without his armor and weapons, but his eyes still held defiance, and Jake asked why they had attacked Earth, and it was the same question he had asked every single day for 3 weeks, and every day Vexthor had remained silent. Today, however, was different, and Vexthor finally spoke, and his voice came through the translation device, and he said, "Because you were there, and because the Empire expands and humanity was in the way, and because humans were weak." Jake noticed the past tense and said, "We're weak, not are weak," and Vexthor said that the human victory was just luck and nothing more, and humanity could not defeat the Empire because when the fleet returned, Earth would be crushed. Jake said maybe that was true, but he said that humanity would make them pay for every ship they sent, and every soldier they landed would face humans who refused to give up. And he explained that humanity had spent its entire history fighting nature and fighting each other and fighting just to survive, and Vexthor had picked a fight with a species that was really, really good at fighting. In the war room, General Paul Hayes was briefing President Helen Carter and the newly formed Unified Earth Council, and representatives from every nation sat together, and former rivals were now united by the alien threat. Paul reported that their analysis of the captured technology was yielding results faster than anyone expected because Dr. Lisa Freeman's team had already figured out the basics of their shield systems and their faster-than-light drives, and they were reverse engineering everything they could. Ambassador Chen Wei from China asked how long it would take before humanity could build their own versions, and Paul admitted it would take years for full implementation, but they could start putting hybrid systems on existing ships within months, and more importantly, they were learning the weaknesses of Zarkonian technology. Colonel Steve Martinez pulled up a star chart and explained that they had interrogated the Zarkonian database, and the Empire controlled approximately 400 star systems, and they had conquered 37 different species over the course of 3,000 years. Helen said so. Now the Empire knew that humans were number 38, except humanity did not get conquered. And Steve said with a slight smile that no, they certainly did not. Dr. Lisa Freeman entered the room carrying a data tablet, and she said that she had finished analyzing the Zarkonian communications network, and when those 3 ships escaped, they had sent a detailed report back to the Empire, and she had managed to intercept and translate the response from Zarkonian High Command. She projected the message for everyone to see, and it was brief, and it said that the invasion force had been destroyed by a primitive species, and human technological level was insufficient to explain the defeat, and they recommended quarantine of the Sol system pending further analysis, and the species designation had been upgraded to hazardous, and all Zarkonian forces should avoid contact with humans. Silence filled the room as everyone understood what this meant, because the vast Zarkonian Empire, which had conquered dozens of species and ruled hundreds of worlds, was now actually afraid of humanity. Someone asked if that meant they were not coming back, and Lisa said not immediately, but this would not last forever because eventually their leadership would decide that leaving humanity alone was too dangerous, and they would come back with overwhelming force to finish what they started. Helen said then humanity needed to be ready, and she told Paul that she was authorizing Operation Outreach and explained that they were not going to wait for the aliens to come back to Earth because humanity was going to take the fight to them. Over the next months, humanity transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible before, and the nations of Earth, which had been unified by a common threat, pooled their resources and knowledge, and the space program expanded at a rate that broke All records and captured Zarkonian technology combined with human innovation produced a new generation of warships that were faster and deadlier than anything Earth had built before. But more importantly, humanity did something the Zarkonians never expected, which was that they went on the offensive instead of staying home and waiting. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded the first mission, and the TSS Horizon had been completely rebuilt and upgraded with hybrid Earth-Zarkonian technology, and alongside it flew 5 more ships of the new Defender class, and each one was crewed by volunteers who had fought in the Battle of Earth. Their mission was simple, and it was to deliver a message to the Zarkonian Empire and show them that humanity was not going to hide. The fleet arrived at the edge of Zarkonian space at a minor colony world, and they did not attack the colony, and instead they simply appeared and demonstrated their new faster-than-light capabilities, and transmitted a message on all frequencies before jumping away again. The message was delivered in Zarkonian and English and 30 other Earth languages, and it said, "This is Admiral Jake Morrison of the United Earth Fleet, and 3 weeks ago your empire attacked our world without any provocation, and you expected an easy conquest, but you were wrong." The message continued and said that humanity had defeated your fleet and captured your commander and studied your technology and found it adequate, and humanity had reverse-engineered your weapons and improved them, and we know the locations of your worlds and the strength of your fleets and the weaknesses of your leadership. Jake's voice in the message said, "This is not a declaration of war, but this is a warning. And humanity is done being prey and done being targets, and we have left your colony unharmed as a gesture of the restraint you never showed us." But the message was clear that if the Empire attacked Earth again, humanity would not simply defend because they would retaliate and bring the fight to every one of the 400 worlds and show the Zarkonians what it meant to awaken a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting warfare. The message said you wanted to conquer humanity, and congratulations because you just declared war on the most lethal species in the galaxy, and we are just getting started. It told them to stay away from Earth, and stay away from the solar system, and stay away from any system humanity claimed, because if they did not, then they would learn what every predator on Earth had eventually learned, which was that humans are not prey, because humans are apex predators. The message ended by saying, "And we never forgive, and we never forget, and we never stop." And it included coordinates but not of Earth, because instead it gave the locations of 3 secret military installations humanity had established in neighboring star systems, and it was both a challenge and a warning combined. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter watched the stars from her office window, and Colonel Steve Martinez stood beside her, and he asked if she thought the Zarkonians would leave humanity alone. Helen said no, honestly, and explained that eventually they would come back, but when they did, they would not be facing the same species they had attacked because they would be facing humanity united and armed and very, very angry. She turned from the window and said that humanity had spent its whole history preparing for this, without knowing it. And every war and every conflict and every struggle had taught humans how to fight. And the Zarkonians had just learned what happens when you pick a fight with a species that spent its entire existence becoming the most efficient killers in its evolutionary history. Steve said quietly that humans were not killers but survivors, and Helen replied that sometimes those were the same thing. Across the galaxy, the message reached the Zarkonian High Council, and they debated for a long time about what to do about the human problem, and some wanted immediate retaliation, while others urged caution, but all of them recognized one truth. They had made a grave mistake, and they had attacked a species that refused to be conquered, and they had awakened a sleeping predator and given it a reason to evolve beyond its world, and they had in their arrogance created the one thing that could threaten their empire, which was a determined, united humanity, with something to prove and nothing left to lose. The galaxy would learn to respect humanity one way or another, and somewhere in the void between stars, Admiral Jake Morrison and his fleet patrolled the borders of human space, ready to defend their home and carry their message to any species foolish enough to threaten Earth again, because the age of human expansion had begun.